There is a specific kind of silence that exists only where great value is kept. It is not merely the absence of noise, it is a heavy, respectful stillness, as if the air itself is holding its breath to protect the treasures hidden within. Most people believe that money is loud. It clinks, it rustles, it shouts in the busy marketplaces of the world. But here, at the source, money is born in absolute quiet. Tonight, you are the only one awake to witness it. The rain over London had turned the city into a blurred painting of greys and indigos. It was a cold, persistent November rain, the kind that drummed a rhythmic tattoo against the roofs of carriages and washed the soot from the cobblestones. But here, standing before the imposing iron gates of the Royal Mint, the storm felt like a distant memory. The walls of this fortress were thick granite, built to withstand centuries, built to keep the chaos of the world outside and the order of the wealth inside. Mr. Arthur Sterling stood under the shelter of the stone archway, shaking his umbrella. Drops of water flew from the black fabric, landing on the pavement like transient diamonds before disappearing into the wet stone. Arthur was a man of precise habits. He was the chief inspector of the night watch, a title that sounded far more dramatic than the peaceful reality of his work. His job was not to fight, but to observe, to ensure that in the sleeping hours the millions of coins resting in the vaults remained perfect, untouched, and safe. He checked his pocket watch. The gold casing felt smooth and warm against his thumb. The white face of the watch gleamed in the gaslight. 3 minutes past midnight. Right on time. In the world of finance, precision was not a luxury, it was the very foundation of trust. And Arthur trusted time more than anything. He approached the heavy oak door, inset with iron studs. He didn't need to knock. The night porter, a man named George who moved with the slow deliberation of a tortoise, was already drawing back the heavy bolts on the other side. Thud. Clank. Creak. The sounds were heavy, satisfying. They were the sounds of security. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," George murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the stone vestibule.
Good evening, George. What one tonight?
"Indeed, sir. The fires are lit in the lower counting room." Arthur stepped inside, and the heavy door was closed and bolted behind him, sealing out the wind and the rain. The silence descended immediately. It was a profound, instant relief. The air inside the mint smelled different. It didn't smell of damp earth or city smoke. It smelled of stone, of polished brass, of floor wax, and, faintly, distinctly, of metal. It was a clean, sharp scent, cold and metallic, like the smell of a key on a winter's morning. Arthur began his nightly ritual of preparation. He moved to the cloakroom, his leather shoes making a crisp clip-clop sound on the checkered marble floor. The hallway was long and high-ceilinged, lined with portraits of past masters of the mint, stern men in wigs who watched him with painted eyes. Arthur nodded to them. He was part of their lineage now, a guardian of the realm's reserves. In the cloakroom, he removed his heavy wet overcoat. He hung it on a wooden peg, smoothing the fabric down with his hands. He removed his hat, placing it on the shelf. Then he approached his locker. He took out his work jacket, a coat of pristine white cotton, tailored to fit him perfectly. He slipped his arms into the sleeves. The fabric was cool and stiff, buttoning up to the neck. It made him feel clinical, precise, like a surgeon of silver. Next came the most important part of the uniform. The gloves. They were made of soft white cotton, delicate yet durable. Arthur pulled them on slowly. He tugged at the fingers, ensuring there were no wrinkles. He flexed his hands. The gloves were essential. Human skin contains oils, acids, and moisture that can tarnish the perfect luster of a freshly minted coin. To touch the gold and silver, one had to be pure. One had to be separated from the metal by this layer of white softness. Arthur took a deep breath. He was ready. He picked up his lantern, though he barely needed it. The corridors were lit by low-burning gas lamps that cast pools of warm yellow light at regular intervals. He began his descent. The Mint was like an iceberg. The offices were above, but the heart of the operation lay deep underground, insulated by feet of earth and stone. He walked down the spiral stone staircase. Step, step, step. The air grew cooler as he descended. It was a stable temperature, maintained carefully to prevent humidity. Down here, the seasons did not exist. There was no summer heat to warp the wood, no winter frost to crack the metal. There was only the eternal, cool stability of the vault level. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stood before the grand vault corridor. It stretched out before him, a tunnel of shadows and light. On either side were the heavy steel doors of the individual storage rooms. These were not ordinary doors. They were masterpieces of engineering, massive slabs of steel and copper, fitted with tumblers and gears that required a specific, complex dance to open. Arthur walked to the first door on the left, the silver room. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a keyring. It jangled softly, a musical sound in the quiet corridor. He selected a long, intricate brass key. He inserted it into the keyhole. The metal felt cold and solid. He turned it. Click. Tick. Tock. The internal mechanism of the lock woke up. He could feel the vibrations of the gears shifting through the handle of the key. It was a sensation of heavy machinery moving with the lightness of a feather. He spun the large wheel on the door. It turned smoothly, silently, thanks to the oiling he had supervised just last week. With a deep, resonant groan, the steel door swung outward. Arthur stepped across the threshold. He raised his lantern. The light played across the room, and the room answered back with 1,000 sparkles. This was not a room of loose coins. This was a room of potential. Sacks of raw silver grain sat in the corner, heavy canvas bags that slumped with their own weight. But on the long wooden tables in the center of the room, the finished product was stacked. Rows and rows of silver crowns and shillings. They were stacked in pillars, wrapped in paper, but some were loose, awaiting inspection. The silver caught the lamplight and fractured it, sending beams of white moonlight bouncing off the stone walls. Arthur approached the nearest table. He placed his lantern down. The light flickered, making the shadows of the silver stacks dance gently. He felt a wave of calm wash over him. This was his domain. The chaotic numbers of the stock market, the screaming of the trading floor, the stress of banks, all of that noise ended here. Here, finance was physical. It was tangible. It was just metal, weight, and gravity. He reached out a gloved hand and picked up a single silver coin from a tray. It was a half-crown, freshly minted that very afternoon. It was cold, even through his glove. He held it up to the light. The relief of the king's profile was sharp, the edges crisp and defined. He ran his thumb over the milled edge, the tiny ridges designed to prevent clipping. Zip, a tiny sound of texture against the cotton glove. He brought the coin closer to his ear and tapped it gently with his fingernail. Ting! It sang, a high, clear, bell-like note that lingered in the air for a second before fading. Only pure silver sang like that. Counterfeit metal sounded dull, a thud rather than a song. But this was perfect. This was the voice of value. Arthur placed the coin back on the tray with a soft clink. He looked at the thousands of coins around him. Each one was identical. Each one was perfect. There was something deeply soothing about this repetition. In a world full of unpredictability, the mint offered uniformity. He walked slowly around the table, his eyes scanning the stacks. He wasn't looking for mistakes, errors were rare. He was simply appreciating the order. He stopped by a wooden crate filled with blanks of the round discs of silver before they were stamped. They looked like smooth, flat moons. He ran his hand over them, the metal flowing under his fingers like a cold, heavy liquid. The sound of metal sliding on metal was like water rushing over stones. He took a ledger from the shelf. It was a heavy book bound in red leather. He opened it to the page dated for today. He uncapped his fountain pen. The ink was black, deep, and permanent. Room 1, Silver Reserve, he wrote. His handwriting was looped and elegant. Status: secure. Temperature: optimal. Count: verified. The scratching of the pen nib on the thick, cream-colored paper was the loudest sound in the room. Took scritch, scratch, dot. He closed the book. The leather cover made a soft puff of air as it shut. Arthur stood there for a moment longer, just breathing in the silence. He felt the weight of the silver around him, not as a burden, but as an anchor. It grounded him. The storm outside could rage all it wanted in here. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He picked up his lantern. It was time to move deeper. The silver room was just the beginning. Beyond this lay the copper hall, and beyond that, the most silent, most heavy room of all. The vault of gold. He stepped out of the room, pulling the heavy steel door shut. Clang! He spun the wheel. Spin, click. Locked, secure. He turned back to the dark corridor. The shadows seemed to stretch out, inviting him further in. He adjusted his white gloves, feeling the fabric tighten around his wrists. He took a step towards the next door, his footsteps fading into the darkness, ready to inspect the next treasure in this palace of quiet finance. Arthur Sterling stepped back into the corridor. The heavy steel door of the silver room clicked shut behind him, sealing away the moonlight brilliance of the white metal. He stood for a moment in the hallway, readjusting his eyes to the gaslight. The silence here was different now. It felt deeper, as if the earth above them had added another layer of quiet pressure. He picked up his lantern and continued his patrol, moving further down the stone passage. The air began to change. The sharp, cold crispness of the silver sector gave way to something warmer, something more grounded. He could smell it before he reached the door. A distinct metallic tang that tasted faintly of iron and earth. It was the scent of copper. He stopped before a door made of dark, reinforced oak, bound with iron straps. This was the entrance to the copper hall. Unlike the high-security steel of the silver vault, this room held the people's money, the pennies, the farthings, the halfpennies. These were the coins that traveled through the rough hands of laborers, the aprons of bakers, and the pockets of schoolchildren. Arthur selected a large, heavy iron key from his ring. It was older than the brass key, its teeth worn smooth by decades of use. He slid it into the lock. The mechanism was stiff, requiring a firm, deliberate turn of his wrist. The bolt slid back with a heavy thud. Arthur pushed the door open. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. He stepped inside. The atmosphere in the copper hall was visibly different. If the silver room was moonlight, this room was a sunset. The lantern light washed over vast rows of wooden bins, not tables. These bins were filled to the brim with millions of copper coins, creating a landscape of deep, warm browns, oranges, and reds. The light caught the fresh coins, making them glow like embers in a dying fire. Arthur walked softly across the floor. The ground here was paved with brick, not stone, which absorbed the sound of his footsteps, making his movement almost ghostly. He approached one of the large oak bins. It was waist-high and filled with newly minted pennies.
He placed the lantern on a nearby shelf and looked down at the sea of copper.
He reached out his gloved hand. The white cotton contrasted sharply with the dark reddish metal. He plunged his hand into the bin. Clatter. The sound was fundamentally different from the silver. It was not a musical chime. It was a dry, cascading rustle. It sounded like heavy rain falling on a dry roof, or like pebbles being dragged back by the ocean tide. It was a chaotic, yet deeply comforting sound. Arthur scooped up a handful of coins and let them slide through his fingers back into the pile. Thud, tap, clatter, thud. They fell with a satisfying heaviness. Copper was a dense material. It carried the weight of commerce, the weight of daily life. He repeated the motion, mesmerizing himself with the visual of the coins flowing like a slow, metallic liquid. He watched the light glint off the raised profile of the king, off the figure of Britannia holding her trident. He wasn't just playing, he was checking the flow. Coins that stuck together or felt jagged indicated a problem with the stamping molds. But these flowed smoothly, like water. Arthur dusted his gloved hands, tiny particles of copper dust dancing in the lantern light. He turned his attention to the center of the room. Here stood the pride of the copper hall, the great scales. It was a massive weighing instrument, encased in a glass and mahogany box to protect it from drafts. It stood as tall as a man. The central pillar was made of polished brass, and from its crossbeam hung two large, shallow brass pans, suspended by fine chains. This was the ultimate judge of the mint. Counting individual coins was impossible and prone to error. Weighing them was absolute. Arthur approached the scales with reverence. This was the part of the night he enjoyed the most. It was pure physics, pure finance, the search for equilibrium. He opened the glass door of the case.
Squeak, click.
He took a small canvas bag from a nearby cart. It was labeled Batch 482 Farthings. Farthings. He untied the drawstring. The string was rough hemp, fibrous and strong. First, he had to set the standard. On the left-hand pan of the scale, he placed the master weights. These were cylindrical blocks of iron, calibrated to the exact weight of 1,000 farthings. He picked up the first weight. It was heavy, cold. He placed it gently on the brass pan. Clink.
The scale dipped dramatically to the left. The chains pulled tight with a soft jingle.
He placed the second weight. The pan settled. Now for the coins. Arthur lifted the canvas bag. He tilted it over the right-hand pan. He poured slowly. Rattle, slide, crash, tinkle. The copper coins cascaded onto the brass pan. The sound was a crescendo of metal on metal, loud at first, then muffling as the pile grew. The right side of the scale began to descend. The central needle, a long, delicate finger of steel, began to twitch. Arthur poured with a steady hand. He watched the needle. It swung wildly at first, dancing left and right. Swing, swish, swing, swish. He stopped pouring. He had to be precise. He added one coin, then another. Tap, tap. He waited. The room held its breath. The heavy brass palms bobbed up and down, trading energy, seeking balance. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the movement decreased. The needle hovered, it slowed. It quivered one last time, and then came to a rest perfectly in the center, aligned with the red mark of 0. Balance. Perfect mathematical balance. Arthur let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The satisfaction was immense. It was a physical sensation of rightness. In a chaotic world, these coins weighed exactly what they were supposed to weigh. No more, no less. The books would balance. The value was real. He took the ledger again. He wrote with the same slow, deliberate strokes. Room 2, Copper Hall, Batch 4C, wheat, exact. Variance, none. Scritch, scratch, in his dart to grand. He closed the glass door of the scale. He didn't empty the pans yet. He would let them sit for a moment, a monument to accuracy. He walked around the perimeter of the room. The shadows here were long and warm. He passed shelves stacked with ingots of raw copper, looking like bricks of solidified sunset. He passed the cooling racks where the metal strips rested before being punched. Everything was still. The machines that usually roared and stamped during the day were now silent, sleeping giants of cast iron, smelling of oil and grease. Arthur ran a hand along the casing of a stamping press. The metal was cool, but retained a ghost of the day's heat. He felt a kinship with these machines. They were the engines of the economy, but he was the caretaker of their rest. He returned to the center. He carefully bagged the coins again, tying the hemp knot tight. He removed the weights from the scale. Clink, lift. The pans swung free, empty and light once more. Arthur picked up his lantern. The orange glow of the copper hall seemed to cling to him, reluctant to let him go. But the final task awaited. The deepest room. The smallest room. The room that held the sun itself. He stepped out, the iron key turning in the lock one last time.
Like thud.
He was back in the corridor. The air grew colder again. He walked towards the end of the tunnel where a single, formidable door stood. It was smaller than the others but built like the entrance to a fortress. It had no keyhole. It had a dial. Arthur adjusted his collar. He smoothed his white gloves. He was about to enter the gold vault. Arthur Sterling stood alone at the end of the corridor. The air here was perfectly still, devoid of even the slightest draft. Before him stood the final door. It was not the towering oak of the copper hall, nor the wide steel of the silver room. This door was compact, circular, and painted a deep industrial black. It looked less like a door and more like the hatch of a submarine, built to withstand immense pressure. There was no keyhole here. No jagged piece of brass could grant access to this room. There was only a single polished steel dial in the center, surrounded by a ring of engraved numbers from 0 to 99. And Bruggetespaks Monjigumpexka papers. He placed his lantern on the floor. The light cast long, upward shadows against the rivets of the door. Arthur took off his right glove for a brief moment. He needed the raw sensitivity of his fingertips for this. He placed his thumb and forefinger on the cold, smooth rim of the dial. The steel was freezing, biting into his skin with a sharp clarity that focused his mind completely. He closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the numbers, he knew the combination by muscle memory. But more importantly, he needed to hear the mechanism. He began to turn the dial to the left. Spin, spin, spin. The dial moved with a silky, fluid resistance. Inside the door, deep within layers of hardened steel, brass tumblers were waking up. He listened. Past the silence of the corridor, past the beating of his own heart, he heard the faint, almost imperceptible click of the first tumbler falling into place. It was a sound so small it was almost a feeling. He stopped instantly. He reversed direction, turning the dial to the right. This time the movement was slower. He counted the degrees in his head. 1, 2, 3. The friction of the dial against the casing created a low, smooth hiss of metal on metal. He approached the second number. He slowed down to a crawl. He felt the vibration in his fingertips before he heard the sound. The click. The second gate opened. One last turn, back to the left. This was the final sequence. Arthur held his breath. The tension in the air was palpable. He moved the dial millimeter by millimeter. The world narrowed down to this single circle of steel. Click. A louder sound this time. The internal bolt retracted with a deep, resonant thunk that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of his shoes. The vault was unlocked. Arthur put his white glove back on. He gripped the large, three-spoke wheel handle in the center of the door. He pulled. The door was incredibly heavy, weighing several tons, but it was balanced so perfectly on its hinges that it swung open with a slow, majestic grace. As the seal broke, a puff of air escaped, air that had been trapped inside since the last inspection. It smelled of absolutely nothing. It was a sterile, vacuum-like scent. The scent of eternity. He picked up his lantern and stepped over the high threshold. He was inside the gold vault. The room was surprisingly small. It didn't need to be large. Gold is dense. Immense value occupies very little space. The walls here were lined with shelves, but unlike the other rooms, these shelves were covered in thick, dark blue velvet, and resting on them were the bars.
String
T, 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 T. On its comments, Onayun clarified the unharmonious role played at Tormtor's face. The lantern light flooded the room, and the reaction was instantaneous. The gold didn't sparkle like the silver. It didn't glow warmly like the copper. Instead, it seemed to hold the light. The gold bars sat there, rows upon rows of them, emitting a deep, rich, buttery radiance. They looked heavy just sitting there. They looked ancient. This was the standard. This was the anchor of the entire nation's economy, resting here in the dark, silent and immovable. Arthur walked to the central table, which was also draped in heavy velvet. On it sat a single stack of bullion bars that needed to be audited tonight. There were no scales here. The weight of a standard gold bar was so precise, so universally known, that one only needed to touch it to know it was real. Arthur approached the stack. He felt a wave of reverence. This wasn't money for spending. This was money for keeping. He reached out with both hands. He couldn't lift a gold bar with one hand, not with the respect it deserved. He wrapped his gloved fingers around the sides of the top bar. The metal was smooth, almost oily to the touch, despite being dry. It was colder than ice. He applied pressure and lifted. TUBB broadcasts. The weight was shocking. It always was. Gold is deceptive. It looks small, but it pulls towards the earth with a ferocious gravity. As Arthur lifted the bar, he felt the strain in his forearms. It was a dense, compact heaviness that made him feel grounded. He moved the bar slowly through the air, careful not to let it slip. He placed it down on the empty side of the velvet table. Thump. The sound was unique. It was a dull, heavy, dead sound. There was no ring, no rattle, The gold hit the velvet and stopped instantly. It was the sound of absolute finality. Arthur paused, admiring the trapezoidal shape of the bar, the stamped serial number on the top face.
A9992.
He reached for the second bar. Lift, strain, move, lower. Thump, he stacked it on top of the first. The metal surfaces met with a soft clack, instantly muffled by the weight of the bars pressing them together. There was no friction, just immediate, solid contact. Arthur fell into a trance-like rhythm. The repetitive motion of lifting and stacking was hypnotic. It was a workout for the body, but a massage for the mind. Lift, silence, lower, thump. The stack grew. Arthur wasn't just counting. He was verifying the existence of the reserve. With every bar he moved, he felt the stability of the world being reaffirmed. The chaos of the markets, the panic of the stock exchanges, the noise of the streets, none of it mattered in here. In here, there was only mass and gravity. He paused to wipe a speck of imaginary dust from one of the bars. The gold was soft, he had to be gentle. A fingernail could scratch it. He treated each bar like a sleeping infant. He looked at the reflection of the lantern flame in the smooth surface of the metal. The gold turned the orange flame into a deep, molten yellow. It was mesmerizing. The scepter of Victorian Royal Mint. He took out a special ledger from his pocket. This one was bound in black leather, smaller than the others. He opened it. Vault 3, Gold Reserve, he wrote. Stack 7, verified. Condition, immaculate. He didn't use a fountain pen here. He used a pencil. Ink could spill, graphite was safe. The sound of the pencil on the paper was a soft whisper. Scritch, scritch. Arthur finished the stack. He stood back, his chest rising and falling slowly. The physical exertion had warmed him in the cold room. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The gold was safe. It hadn't moved. It hadn't changed. It was simply there, waiting, holding its value in the dark. So he looked around the small room one last time. The silence here was thicker than anywhere else. It was a silence that felt like a heavy blanket wrapped around his mind. The gold absorbed sound, absorbed light, absorbed time. Arthur felt the urge to lie down on the floor, right there next to the shelves, and sleep in this perfect, safe, heavy quiet. But his work was nearly done. He picked up the lantern. The shadows swung across the gold bars, making them look for a second like a city of golden skyscrapers seen from above. He stepped backward, crossing the threshold. He gripped the heavy wheel of the door. He pushed. The door swung shut. The seal re-engaged with a hiss of air. Whoosh, thud. He grabbed the dial. He spun it forcefully to the right, scrambling the tumblers inside. Whir. Click. Locked. The gold was once again sealed away from the world, returned to its eternal slumber. Arthur stood in the corridor. He felt lighter now, having left that immense density behind. His muscles were tired in a good, satisfying way. He turned his eyes toward the stairs. It was time to ascend, time to return to the surface, write his final report, and find his own rest. The mint was secure. The night was complete. Arthur turned away from the black door of the gold vault. The dial was spun, the tumblers were scrambled, and the silence of the underground was restored. He began the long walk back. His footsteps on the stone floor were slower now, lacking the sharp purpose of the arrival. They were the footsteps of a man who has carried a heavy burden and laid it down successfully. He passed the copper hall, dark and warm. He passed the silver room, cold and glittering behind its steel wall. He walked through the tunnel of shadows, the lantern swinging gently at his side, casting a pendulum of light. Left, right, left, right. He reached the spiral staircase. He placed his hand on the cold iron railing. He began to climb. Step, step, step. The ascent was a shedding of layers. With every rotation of the spiral stairs, he felt the heavy, pressurized atmosphere of the vaults falling away. The air grew slightly less dense. The temperature rose by a fraction of a degree. He was rising from the depths of the earth, returning to the world of the living, the world of breath and rain. When he reached the top of the stairs, the familiar hallway of the main floor greeted him. It was exactly as he had left it, watched over by the painted eyes of the old masters. But now, the gas lamps seemed dimmer, softer, as if the building itself was struggling to stay awake. Arthur walked to the cloakroom. The sound of his shoes on the marble was no longer a clip-clop, but a soft shuffle. He set the lantern down on the wooden bench. It was time to deconstruct the persona of the inspector. He reached for his left glove. He pulled each finger loose, tug, 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 and slid the white cotton off his hand. He did the same with the right. He looked at his bare hands. They were pink, human, and tired. He placed the gloves neatly on the shelf. They would wait there, pristine and ready, for tomorrow night. But tonight, his hands were done with golds. He unbuttoned the stiff white work jacket. Button, button, button. He shrugged it off his shoulders, feeling a rush of cool air hit his shirt. He hung the jacket on its peg. He put on his own heavy wool cardigan. It was old, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and smelled of tobacco and home. It was a warm embrace. He instantly felt softer, less rigid. The armor of the mint was gone. Arthur walked to the main desk in the center of the office. The large ledger lay open where he had left it hours ago. He picked up his fountain pen one last time. He didn't need to look at the nib. He simply signed his name at the bottom of the page. Arthur Sterling. A flourish of ink. A final dot. He closed the book. Thump. The sound was final. The day was recorded. The history of the mint was secure. Have a sky. He moved to the small side table where a crystal carafe of water sat on a silver tray. He poured a glass. The water gurgled softly, a liquid, musical sound that broke the silence of the room. He lifted the glass to his lips. The water was cool, clean, and refreshing. He felt it wash away the metallic taste of the air downstairs. He took a deep breath, exhaling a long, slow sigh that seemed to empty his lungs of all tension. In the mysterious renewal. Maze a whistle trend. It will go like a whistle. Now he could hear it again. It was still falling outside, but the storm had passed its peak. Now it was a steady, rhythmic drumming against the high windows of the office. Patter, It was a beautiful sound. It was the sound of the world being washed clean. It was a lullaby sung by the sky to the city of London. Arthur walked to the window and looked out. The street lamps were blurry halos in the mist. The city was asleep. The banks were closed. The markets were silent. Everyone was resting. And now he could join them. He walked to the back of the office, to the small resting quarters reserved for the night watch. It was a tiny room, essentially just a nook, containing a large leather armchair, a small fireplace with dying embers, and a heavy wool blanket. The room smelled of wood smoke and old leather. It was the coziest place in the entire building. Arthur extinguished the lantern. The flame died, plunging the room into a soft grey darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the fireplace embers and the streetlights filtering through the rain. He sat down in the leather armchair. The chair groaned softly, welcoming his weight. He sank back. He lifted his legs onto the footstool. Settle, sink, relax. He pulled the wool blanket up over his legs, then up to his chest. It was heavy and scratchy in a comforting way. It trapped his body heat instantly. He felt a wave of warmth spread from his toes, up his shins, past his knees, settling deep in his stomach. His eyelids felt incredibly heavy. They were like the lead weights in the copper hall, pulling down, down, down. He listened to the rain. It wrapped around the building like a cocoon. Tap, chat, shh. He thought of the silver room, silent and bright. He thought of the copper hall, warm and earthy. He thought of the gold vault, heavy and deep. They were all safe. They were all locked. He didn't need to worry about them anymore. His breathing slowed down. Inhale, deep and slow. Exhale, letting go of the day. His hands curled loosely in his lap. His jaw unclenched. His shoulders dropped away from his ears. He was no longer the inspector. He was just a man, warm and dry in a wet world. The shadows in the room stood still. The clock on the wall ticked softly, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It didn't demand attention. It just marked the passage of peace. Arthur felt himself drifting. He was floating away from the Mint, floating away from London. He was drifting on a river of sleep. The darkness was soft velvet. The silence was heavy gold. The warmth was deep copper. Everything was balanced. Everything was accounted for. Drifting, sinking. The rain whispered to him, "Sleep, sleep, sleep." There was nothing left to do. Nothing left to count. Just rest. Deep, heavy rest. Good night, Mr. Sterling. Good night, London.